Good evening. My name is Jeffrey Michaels, and I'm the IEN Senior Fellow at eBay. I'd like to welcome all of you to eBay's seminar series on U.S. foreign policy. The series is part of a joint initiative of eBay and the Barcelona Institute of North American Studies, and the series aims to promote discussion of U.S. foreign policy-related topics by inviting both scholars and practitioners to share their research and provide their insights. This evening, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome an old friend and co-author, Andy Payne, who will be speaking on how electoral politics affects U.S. presidential decision-making in war. Now, speaking for myself, although this may be the case with many others as well, there's often a feeling, a suspicion, that politicians in wartime are obviously concerned about winning wars, but even more obviously they want to get reelected, and that there will be times when what might be needed or perceived to be needed to win a war conflicts with what might be needed to win an election. And if this is the case, how to reconcile these conflicting needs. But although we might have suspicions about this, Andrew's actually investigated this phenomenon in great depth and knows more about the subject than anyone probably. So just to give a bit of background, Andrew is the Hedley Bull Research Fellow in International Relations at the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford. He also serves on the board of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, better known as Chatham House. And I first met him some years ago when he was head of the Oxford University Strategic Studies Group. Andy, I hope you'll forgive me for that, but I wanted to get that plug in. Andrew's work on electoral politics and U.S. decision-making in war has received a great deal of recognition already. His first proper journal article on the subject, which was focused on the Iraq War, similar to tonight's presentation, was published in International Security, which in our field is, I think, quite literally the highest honor. And he's also recently secured a contract with Columbia University Press for a book on the subject, which also looks at the wars in Korea and Vietnam as well. And on a much less glamorous note, Andy and I have been working for about a year now on the foreign policy activities of the American president-elect, and we have an article on the subject that will be coming out relatively shortly in Presidential Studies Quarterly. So I just sort of flagged that one up, and sorry I had to get that plug in there as well. So Andrew, thanks so much for accepting the invitation to speak this evening, and I look forward to your presentation, which should be loading up momentarily.
Great. Well, while that all loads up, let me thank you, Jeff, for that kind introduction and the invitation to speak. There we go. And thanks to everyone for dialing in today. I think, Jeff, you actually articulated my own project better than I can. So I hope that people don't just leave the call now. But I will do my best to fill in a few gaps there. But as Jeff suggests, I'm going to talk a little bit about the book project that I'm working on, which explores the impact of electoral politics on presidential decision-making in war. So let me just see if I can work the arrows. There we go. All right, so here's what's coming up. First, I'll talk to you a little bit about the puzzle that motivates this project and why I think we should care. And really my aim here is to convince you that your decision to dial in was a wise one. And if I manage to pique your interest, I'll then go on to offer my answer for why, how, and when elections matter. I think Jeff is quite right. We all have this intuitive sense that elections matter in some way in wartime decision making, but exactly why, how, and when is not really quite so clear. So then I'll illustrate that in practice with a case study of the Iraq surge of 2007, and I'll wrap up in good time so we can discuss any comments and reactions that you have. So if I had to summarize this book in one quote, it would be this one. Here we have President Richard Nixon meeting with his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, and it's August 1972, and they're talking about the war in Vietnam. Now at that stage, US troops had been engaged there for years, supporting South Vietnamese troops against communist forces in the north. And Nixon had been elected, of course, 4 years prior to this on a pledge to ensure peace with honor. But 4 years had elapsed and the war was now quickly becoming a strategic distraction, at least Nixon thought so. And in any case, he had bigger things to deal with, right? He wanted to pursue détente with the USSR and friendly relations with China. And in any case, he felt that the war was essentially hopeless by this point. If 500,000 troops couldn't succeed after years of fighting, he felt, what were they really doing there? So Nixon wanted out, and he was willing to take, quote, frankly, almost anything to get Vietnam off his plate. But there was a catch. Halfway through this conversation, he turns to Kissinger and he says, "We have to realize, Henry, that winning an election is terribly important. The South Vietnamese government was probably never going to survive anyway, but if it collapsed prior to November that year, it could spell disaster for the president's re-election hopes." So the pair set about finding some formula that kept South Vietnam afloat just long enough that Nixon's future could be assured, and so that any subsequent collapse didn't look like it happened on his watch. And those of you familiar with the Vietnam literature will know this as the decent interval strategy. So I think this illustrates a central point, right? It's an inconvenient truth, which is rarely admitted, except in private conversations like this, that presidents habitually take electoral considerations into account when they're making decisions about military and diplomatic strategy in war. They're commander-in-chief, but they're also the holder of the highest elected office in the United States, and so they have to balance these often competing objectives of the national interest on one hand with personal political survival on the other. Now, to put it another way, as former CIA Director John Brennan told me in a recent interview, if you're going to be involved in some type of foreign activity that's going to take resources and entail risks to forces, you need to do it in a manner that's both most practical and most effective, but at the same time, try to keep your political support at home in terms of election cycles, both midterm elections as well as presidential elections. But here's the puzzle, which I think Jeff alluded to quite well earlier. We all have some intuitive sense elections matter, but how, why, when do they do so? And I think it's often invoked in an ad hoc manner to add color to historical accounts, but the systematic relationship between the electoral cycle and presidential decision-making, I think, is a blind spot in the literature on US foreign policy. So my book really is trying to address this problem, right? Exploring the surprising yet nuanced ways in which electoral constraints have shaped really all of America's major wars since 1945. So why then do elections matter? Well, the idea that elections act as a kind of constraint on decision makers stems from the broader literature on democratic accountability and war. And the basic idea here is really quite simple. Ordinary citizens bear the brunt of the human and financial costs of war, and as a result, they bear a natural aversion to conflict. Right, so images like this one, you see flag-draped coffins coming from battlefields in faraway lands. This tends to increase opposition to an ongoing war, and of course, it's bad news for elected officials. In a democracy, we have elections, which are periodic opportunities for voters to punish leaders who are perceived to get involved recklessly in wars. And we also know, of course, that democratic leaders want to stay in office, so they're incentivized to act with a degree of caution in matters of war and peace for fear of later reprisal at the ballot box. Now, that's actually a little bit of a simplification. The actual relationship between public opinion and war is, in fact, a bit more complicated than this. The public doesn't only care about the cost of war, for instance. They also care about the outcomes and the goals of a conflict. We also know from other research that they'll stomach more casualties if they think the mission is sufficiently worthwhile. So they're more likely to support a conflict, for instance, if they think that it's in the vital national security interest or self-defense, rather than, for instance, if it's a case of humanitarian intervention. And we also know that the public doesn't like losing wars. Right? Arguably, the only thing worse than getting involved in a war is failing to win at an acceptable cost. But even with those caveats, I think the basic point here holds up quite well. American presidents, of course, aren't up to speed with the latest academic debates about casualty aversion and public attitudes. But they are professional politicians, and as such, they worry about these things, and they seem to have an intuitive understanding that war is a risky business. So by way of example, George W. Bush in 2006 visited troops who were stationed in the Middle East, and he talked about the recent election in 2004 as the ultimate accountability moment. And he told troops, quote, "You don't run for office in a democracy and say, please vote for me, I promise you war." Okay, so how then do elections matter? What kind of behaviors flow from those incentives? Well, in general, we know quite a bit about how public opinion shapes the conflict behavior of democratic leaders. We know, for instance, that they are quite picky about choosing when and where they'll fight. Deciding to commit forces overseas is made considerably easier in cases where the chances of victory are high or where casualty rates are expected to be low. And some studies have actually pointed to those selection dynamics as an explanation for why democracies tend to have pretty impressive war records. By one count, they win 76% of conflicts that they enter. And when actively engaged in an ongoing war, elected office holders tend to adopt military strategies which keep troops out of harm's way. And they can do this by shifting the burden of fighting to coalition allies. They can favor light footprint approaches which prioritize technology, speed, and mobility over manpower and attrition. And to just give one example, you probably remember Barack Obama's foreign policy, famously leading from behind in Libya, relying on local forces and air power in the campaign against ISIS, and an extraordinary increase in the use of drones. But again, this all may well be true, but we still lack a precise account of exactly how specifically electoral pressures shape decision-making at a more granular level. Exactly how do presidents weigh up their competing responsibilities as commander-in-chief and holder of the highest elected office? So here I'll introduce a little bit of theory, but I will spare you most of the details and get to the case as quickly as I can. In the book, I start with this heuristic, which conceptualizes the role of electoral pressures as an intervening variable. That is something that pushes and pulls the president away from a course of action that they might otherwise deem to be strategically optimal. And this is to say that I don't necessarily think that elections independently determine outcomes, but they can affect the nature or the timing of a decision in important ways. So if you look at this diagram, if the president was just paying attention to the national interest, what would be the best course of action on the battlefield, he would select something like option A. But because he has to pay attention to the political risks of option A, he might adapt that course of action in some way and go with outcome B instead. Now, exactly what that looks like in practice, depends on different factors. It depends on the president's perception of the strategic and the electoral dynamics at play, as well as some other considerations like issue salience, which I won't go into now, other than to flag one key point, which is in essence my answer to the when question of when electoral pressures matter. And that is to say that I think the way in which electoral pressures do matter varies considerably and systematically across the electoral cycle. I think we can say, in general, the strength of electoral pressures increases as a presidential election approaches, but it's not a completely linear relationship. And I also don't think that it's just presidential elections that matter. As we'll see in the case that I'll show you in a moment, congressional midterms also present windows of increased political sensitivity that the president must pay attention to, even if his or her name is not on the ballot. So what I'd like to do, instead of going into the granular details of all of the theory, is just focus on one specific way in which I think this balancing process affects presidential behavior. And it's, I think, really the most common way that you see, certainly throughout the history that I've examined since World War II. And that's what I call the delay mechanism. As you see here, I describe this as follows. When faced with a clear need to change strategy or authorize a significant military operation in the lead up to an election, the president's first preference is likely to be to delay making any decision until after polling day, right? To kick something into the long grass. Now, why is this? Again, in general, we know that long, drawn-out wars are unpopular, mounting casualties and the financial costs of war take its toll on the public. So we can surmise that as an election approaches, a president might not want to send additional troops or launch a big airstrike, even if he thinks that's what's required on the battlefield. Okay, so how would we recognize this behavior in practice? What kind of evidence should we be looking for in the historical record? I think there are four things that I really need to demonstrate. The first, of course, is we need to find evidence that a need for a change in strategy was perceived to be necessary by the president and his national security team. Second, I think we must be able to show that a decision was deferred, right? In the sense that viable opportunities to subject that issue to normal review processes were not pursued. Third, and relatedly, I think we must be able to show that the reason for the delay was specifically electoral in nature. Of course, this is a crucial one. And finally, if a decision was truly delayed, not simply ignored, I think we must be able to find evidence of the same problem being considered in the immediate post-election phase, likely with the degree of urgency that we haven't seen before, and probably a decision being made very quickly. So that's the theory, and it's all very neat and tidy. But we know what kind of evidence we're looking for, but what kind of sources would we need? Where would we find this kind of evidence? I'm not obviously the only person to think that elections might influence decision making, but I think there's a reason why there's not that much literature examining this problem. It's a very good reason, right? Admitting that you're making decisions about war and peace with your own political interests front in mind is not really a good look for a politician. Presidents, they fear leaks, they are sensitive to their own legacies, and so they're not going to put much of those kind of considerations down on paper. And as Lyndon Johnson once said, perhaps uncharitably, quote, "If you have a mother-in-law with only one eye and she has it in the center of her forehead, you don't keep her in the living room." And by the same token, I think if your motivations for selecting a certain option might be perceived as cynical or distasteful by the electorate, probably going to try and keep that from reaching the public record. So I say this to just let you inside the research process a little bit here. Part of this is trawling through the archival record for clues. It's piecing together different pieces of the jigsaw, considering what's said in certain formats, what's not said in key meetings, in memoranda to and from the president, in diaries, and so on and so forth. And for the project, I've visited 8 archives across the United States, including this one. And so this is a photo I took from the Lyndon Johnson Library, which Jeff will know very well, this feeling. You walk in as a researcher, eager to find all of the amazing evidence that you expect to be finding for your project. And you walk over and you go up one set of stairs and you turn around and then you just see this wall of 40,000 red boxes, each of which contains... Oh, Siri's very interested as well. Each of these boxes contains 500, maybe even 1,000 pieces of paper. And really, this exercise is like finding a needle in a haystack. Now, of course, in some cases, like Vietnam, we've got golden resources. Both Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon had secret recording equipment installed in the White House to capture their conversations. And for cases like Vietnam, that's great. But we've also got other cases, more recent cases, like Iraq, for instance, where we don't have that level of material. Most of the documents for Iraq are classified, and presidents, as far as we know, learned their lessons about keeping voice recordings of their conversations. So what I've done instead is rely on interviews. So I've over 24 interviews with senior decision makers and military officials, from CIA directors, White House advisors, and commanding generals of all US forces, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and so on and so forth, to piece together that jigsaw puzzle. Okay, so let's look how this played out then in the Iraq War, specifically under George Bush. And you probably know, of course, that Bush invaded Iraq in 2003, and you probably have your own views on why he did that. I think plenty of ink has been spilled on that decision and what drove it. But what I want to focus on is a different phase of the conflict. So if you fast forward 4 years from the invasion, the war wasn't going very well, right? The United States had not found weapons of mass destruction, but they had toppled Saddam Hussein's government, and US forces were now struggling to fight an insurgency against the new government that they had installed. So in January 2007, George Bush announces a decision to send 30,000 additional troops to Iraq to try to improve security and bring Iraq back from the brink of civil war. And this is the decision that's become known as the surge. And what I argue in my research is that the 2006 election, which in this case was a congressional election, offers a classic example of what I referred to earlier as the delay mechanism. In a nutshell, President Bush, I would argue, perceived a need to change strategy, but feared the electoral implications of doing so prior to the 2006 midterms. So let's walk through how this plays out then. So as I said earlier, the first thing I need to show is not simply that there was a need for change, but that the US National Security Team knew there was, and that Bush was advised of this as well. And there's plenty of evidence for this, right? Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice admitted as much in her memoir, saying that by 2006, quote, "It was becoming painfully obvious that we had neither the right military strategy in Iraq nor enough forces to carry out the flawed one that we were pursuing. Maintaining the status quo was not an option." Megan O'Sullivan, who was Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan, began writing a daily note to President Bush in early 2006, which warned of the deteriorating situation, stating in bold text, quote, "We are executing a plan based on assumptions that are no longer valid." In Baghdad, the US ambassador harbored doubts as well, later recalling his feeling that as early as 2005, our strategies to date had not worked. And back home, the intelligence community shared similar doubts. By the summer of 2006, one intelligence update read that violence has acquired a momentum of its own and is now self-sustaining. Even the Joint Chiefs of Staff were having second thoughts. Mike Mullen, who was then Chief of the Navy, recalls that, quote, "We all knew it wasn't going very well. Quite frankly, there was no strategy, and that's what drove us crazy." And I think crucially, President Bush himself admits realizing that something needed to change in the spring. And he recorded a conversation with his National Security Advisor, Stephen Hedley, in which he said, "This is not working. We need to take another look at the whole strategy. I need to see some new options." So suffice to say, there's an overwhelming sense from virtually all corners of the national security team that the existing strategy was in dire need of change. Okay, so the lack of a strategic review through most of 2006 wasn't for want of an awareness of a need for one, but it also wasn't down to a shortage of attempts to spark one. The State Department came up with a clear hold and build strategy in late 2005, and its author described it to me as the first big effort to tear up and change the strategy, something that recommended you should actually do a goddamn counterinsurgency. That is, you do something like the surge. But that proposal and a similar proposal for a selective counterinsurgency never really got anywhere in the internal debate. It was supposed to be part of a war council meeting with the president to be held in summer 2006, where President Bush was supposed to be meeting with his advisors and they would have this frank, all-out debate about the way forward. Instead, President Bush left halfway through these meetings, using the get-together as cover for a secret trip that he took to Iraq for a photo opportunity with the Prime Minister of Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki, which you can see the photo on the right-hand side. You've got Nouri al-Maliki on the right, then President Bush, of course, the US Ambassador, Zalman Khalilzad, and then the Commander of US Forces, General George Casey. Looking back at this time, one senior official recalled that in a normal decision-making process, quote, "The first thing you do is run a National Security Council process that elicits papers and arguments about strategy from state, defense, and the Joint Chiefs. They never ran such a meeting until like the end of November. Not one. That just simply never happened. And as a result, everything that happened then could have happened more than a year earlier or 2 years earlier." So the persistent failure of the Bush administration to launch a full strategy review, despite all of the strong indications of a need for one and efforts by senior officials to instigate such a process, is fully consistent, I would argue, with the second observable implication of the delay mechanism. Crucially, though, was the reason for that delay electoral in nature? I would suggest there are a lot of elements to this story, but there's certainly evidence to suggest that electoral factors were a very important consideration. In fact, President Bush tells us himself, in his own words. After an NSC meeting in August, according to Bush, quote, I decided a change in strategy was needed, but with the 2006 midterm elections approaching, the rhetoric on Iraq was hot. So I decided to wait until after the elections to announce any policy or personnel changes. I didn't want the American people to think I was making national security decisions for political reasons. Now, putting aside the idea that delaying making a decision that you knew was necessary is somehow keeping national security decisions free of politics, let's put that to one side. I think this statement alone, which is in his memoir, which you see him happily signing in that photo, is pretty persuasive evidence of certain electoral motives here. But beyond this, Condoleezza Rice said at the time that she was not willing to, quote, do anything that would be above the radar screen in the heavy political breathing of the November elections, since the last thing the administration needed was a hothouse story that revealed that things were going so badly in Iraq that the administration was looking for alternative approaches. And as one military officer recalled, quote, with the midterm elections less than 3 months away, any hint that the administration was having second doubts about Iraq was politically radioactive. Serious doubt on changing course would have to wait until voters had had their say. And it's worth noting as well here that the option that Bush was leaning towards at this stage would be deeply unpopular, and he knew it. In June 2006, just 6% of Americans favored an increase in troops. He later recalled in his memoir that the surge option brought risks of its own. Increasing our troop level would be deeply unpopular at home, the fighting would be tough, and casualties could be high. So then the 2006 elections come and pass, and it's a huge turning point. Suddenly, obfuscation gives way to urgency and a proactive attitude by the president, and we very quickly get to the biggest shift in strategy of the entire war. General Casey, who you saw a moment ago, explained that Bush became, quote, noticeably colder in the first video conference after the midterms. He told me, quote, that was when I first kind of said, okay, there's something up here. It was November, right in that early part of November. We've got to do something different. He wants something different, and we need to work at it. I honestly didn't see any desire by the president to change until after that midterm election. Philip Zelikow, a senior State Department official who'd been pushing for a review for over 18 months, similarly explained that basically the day after the election is as if all of a sudden the windows had been opened and fresh air is coming in. And indeed, a formal strategy review process is now activated, and you get a huge flurry of NSC meetings taking place. In them, the minutes clearly show a president with a newfound sense of urgency and a clearly emergent, if not pre-existing, preference for something bold, like a surge of troops. So he says things like, I am running this show. We will take radical action to achieve victory. People are concerned the US is not engaged. Think about symbols, show muscle. Want to win, no mistake, victory. Surge is important. And he repeatedly suggests adding troops. So in opting for the surge, and a 5-brigade surge at that, I think Bush demonstrated a capacity for risk-taking which had simply not been on display over the previous 18 months. He also demonstrated a newfound willingness to overrule those who stood in the way of change, be it the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who felt the addition of troops to be akin to the feeding of an alligator, Casey, who remained adamantly opposed to any increase in troops, or even the Iraqi Prime Minister, who was reportedly very queasy on the whole idea. So the election was a key turning point in the decision-making process on Iraq. Only after President Bush is freed of the constraints of an upcoming election is he able to make what he understood to be the most unpopular decision of his presidency. Now, just to wrap up, in terms of implications, what should we make of all this? Well, in this case, as in many others in the book, we find clear evidence of a presidential reluctance to embrace courses of action which entail a prolonged or an increased military commitment as an election approaches. Those kind of proposals, they may be deemed strategically beneficial, but the likelihood and the timing of their adoption appears to depend, at least in part, on the stage of the electoral cycle. I think these have quite troubling implications if we consider what might have happened were it not for the impact of these electoral pressures. In the Iraq case in particular, it seems likely that something like the surge might have been attempted several months earlier than it was. And we could debate whether lasting success was actually achievable under the revised strategy, and there is a vociferous debate on that, and also on the downstream implications under Obama. But I think at a minimum, we can say that a short-term opportunity existed to limit bloodshed and move towards a resolution of sectarian tensions in Iraq. So there are missed opportunities in Iraq, but I think these findings also challenge the wider assumption that electoral accountability makes democracies good at fighting wars. In practice, we find evidence here that leaders routinely select courses of action which they know to be flawed, right, in ways which are therefore unusually avoidable. And that raises, I think, a related and important normative question. We want elected officials to be responsive to the wishes of voters. That's a core principle of democracy. But here we have evidence of how this diverts foreign policy in directions which the experts know to be suboptimal. So my research shows that electoral considerations shape decision-making, but whether they should do is entirely another matter. And to sum up here, I think as Richard Nixon argued in 1972, when it comes to presidential decision-making in war, winning an election really is terribly important to presidents. Presidents balance competing strategic and electoral preferences when they're making decisions about military strategy in war. And I've shown how this often leads them to delay operations which they think are necessary, but which might carry too much political risk. And I think a greater focus on how, why, and when electoral pressures matter really enriches our understanding of the political context in which military strategy is developed and raises a number of questions about the substantive and normative implications of democratic accountability in war. So plenty to think about, but for now, I want to thank you all for listening. Thanks, Jeff, again for the invitation, and I really look forward to your questions and comments.
Andrew, thank you so much. So now we have about 20 odd minutes for questions. I see Charles has his hand up.
Hello, can you hear me?
Very slightly. Can you raise your voice slightly?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you both. Thank you, Andrew, for that great presentation. I just had a question about, which is probably too soon to ask, is about Ukraine, obviously, and America's desire, or what stated desire that I read in the last couple of days, to degrade the Russian military. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on whether those announcements was influenced at all by the upcoming midterm elections.
It's a great question. Jeff, do you want me to take that?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So it's a really good question. Obviously, as a sort of someone who's a historian masquerading as a political scientist, my instinct is to say nothing about current events and certainly not prognosticate about the future. However, I'll do my best. I think on the specific issue you raised, my understanding of that context, the remarks by Secretary Austin, there may have been less intentional and less behind it than the media made out. And of course, they strike me as slightly strange in that, you know, that furore was misses the point that the entire purpose of what the US has actually been doing and what the West has been doing has been to try to weaken Russia. But in any case, on the electoral dynamics of it, I think so. I don't know about the specific comment there, but the broader way in which Ukraine plays into Biden's political calculations, there's a positive here and there's a negative here. The negative outcome here is that you know, this has played a considerable role in raising gas prices, which has caused Biden to roll back elements of his political agenda, which I think were otherwise going to be central to what he was going to take to voters. So we've heard much less about his climate change goals and so on and so forth, because I think the political salience of gas prices probably outstrips that. But there are positive aspects to this crisis as well. I think Biden took a real hit after the withdrawal from Afghanistan in terms of his reputation for competence really on foreign policy. And Ukraine has given him a huge opportunity to actually look tough, to look competent, to look like he's leading the West again and repatching the liberal international order against a common enemy. And I think it's interesting to see how kind of robustly the political noises coming out of the Biden camp have been, and how much they've changed to try and blame energy crises more and more so on Putin and so on and so forth. The only other thing I'll just add is I don't know that substantive decisions about the strategy towards Ukraine will be made with calculations about the midterms front of mind. I think this is one of those decisions which is over-determined by so many other strategic considerations. I don't really know that there's any alternative path. And this gets, if you go back to the theory that I outlined in that, those arrows that I mapped out there, one key consideration which I think determines the strength of electoral considerations on any given decision is the relative alignment between a president's strategic preference and the electoral preference. And in this case, I think the strategic preference and the electoral preference are basically aligned. There is upside in being tough on Russia in this context politically, and I think it's what Biden deems to be in the core national strategic interest as well. So any electoral considerations here, while there may be positive and negative aspects, those positive aspects I think are pushing against an open door.
Just for those of you who are out there, should you wish to enter your question into the chat box instead, by all means do so. Otherwise, please raise your hand. Andrew, I've got a couple of questions lined up for you, but actually just following on from what Charles has just asked, something that sort of I'm curious about, given that the cases that you've looked at tend to be about American troops in a war, whereas in the case of Ukraine, it's about somebody else's war that the U.S. is, as with other countries, actually assisting, but not directly participating in the same sort of way as you've looked at in other cases. So it sort of raises the question about generalizability and sort of how far can one push these findings about foreign policy crises more generally, and if there's any sort of relevant literature on that that you could that you're drawing on or that you could highlight.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there is some literature. So there's obviously a massive literature on public attitudes towards war, and a kind of whole industry of studies looking at the degree to which the public is sensitive to casualties. And there are a couple, I can't think off the top of my head who the authors are, but there are a couple of studies within that which look at the degree to which Americans care about casualties which are not Americans, including not just local partners that they rely on, but also civilian casualties. And I think there is, if my memory serves, I think there is a degree of sensitivity, but it's not on the level of having American citizens killed in war. I mean, there's nothing, a lot of this is about optics, right? So the image that I showed there of the flag draped coffin alludes to the Dover test, which of course but the the very sight of body bags returning to the homeland, and you seeing and hearing grieving mothers, and even if they're not casualties, you see more and more wounded veterans. When you're going to the mall around America, that I think has a more visceral impact on ordinary Americans, and I think that's been borne out in surveys and studies that have been examined on the topic. So what does that mean? That means, in terms of relation to this topic, it means that electoral considerations, of course, are more significant in cases where US troops are exposed to harm, are put in harm's way. And I think that's exactly why you see particular sensitivity and particular kind of creative ways in which presidents have tried to avoid doing that. And I think I alluded to Obama there as a very, very good example of where you transfer the risk. And that's transfer strategic risk, but it's also transferring political risk of getting involved in conflicts overseas by relying on local partners, by relying on technology rather than manpower and so on and so forth. So it limits the scope conditions, certainly. But I would suggest that the cases that we're left with are still important and interesting to examine on their own merit.
No, very much so. So can I just take you back for a minute and ask, how did you actually go about selecting this topic in the first place? I mean, what got you interested in this question?
Um, It's a good question. The answer is somewhat, it's not the answer that I would tell my students. And I know this is being recorded, so let's hope they don't watch it. I basically was very interested in following elections, and I found myself in an IR department which constantly wanted me to talk about different countries and so on and so forth. And I was constantly getting the question of, why just focused on the US, and that's just domestic politics and so on and so forth. And so I tried to find some way to couple that with a international relations topic. So I thought, well, let's look at wars as well, and different wars in different countries. So it was really a pet interest in following the election campaign, coupled with what can I get through the powers that be at my department. I will say though that my interest, and also I think other people's interest, I hope at least, somewhat catalyzed by the context in which I was doing this research, which is for 4 years we had the Trump presidency. And I think the salience of political considerations as a determinant of national security decision making became a whole lot more transparent during that period. So, like with many things, I think Trump was probably not great for the world in many respects, but as a silver lining, he was good for business in terms of the interest in this research topic.
And I think sort of another question is, not to put it too bluntly, I mean, you've mentioned this issue about democracies more generally, but is there something specifically American about the way that obviously that you've approached this, but about the topic more generally? Do you think that this is also, you can see the same thing happening elsewhere?
So that's a very good question. 1 second. Well,
I just so you know, I only ask good questions.
Quite right. So, is it uniquely American? No, I don't think it is. I think, of course, other countries have elections, other countries fight conflicts. To a degree, I mean, I'm an Americanist, so to a degree, I do think there are some unique characteristics of it. But at a fundamental level, no, it's not completely unique, but there are interesting differences, right? And let me give you a couple of examples, right? One is, and the reason why the US is particularly good to study, the US has a fixed electoral cycle, right? Every 4 years, we know there's going to be an election. Whereas, where I am at the moment, of course, in the UK, even though we've got the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which is supposed to keep it a more fixed term, but in practice, as we've seen throughout history, a prime minister could call an election whenever they want. That changes the incentive structure around how an election might, and how electoral considerations might shape decision making on foreign policy. I think you may see there's a concept called diversionary war theory, which you'll be well versed in, where you can use a crisis overseas, manipulate public opinion by using force overseas in a way that would help you reap political reward, perhaps at an election. And if you've got flexible election timing like in the UK, then it's much more prone to those kinds of considerations. Whereas in the US, if you're in year one and you've got 3 years until the election, voters have very short time horizon spans in what they remember. That consideration, that type of electoral constraint, that type of electoral pressure is much less useful, or its utility is contingent on the stage of the electoral cycle. So certainly I think there'll be similar pressures in the UK context versus the US, but the timing of it varies. I also would say, I won't go into detail unless you want me to, but I think it's very interesting to think about pressures like electoral pressures in states which are actually autocracies, or democracies in which you have uncompetitive elections, right? So Russia, for instance. Electoral pressures may be meaningful to a degree on Putin, but not to the same level. That's not to say that there aren't democratic constraints, as lots of people have been discussing in recent months on Putin, but they just function differently and perhaps less of an electoral component to it.
I would like to get back to the surge in a minute or so, but before that, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about what you've been finding with regards to the Korea and Vietnam case studies, which I think are both ones that you're using for your book, if that's correct.
Yeah, I mean, how long have you got? I'll try and be brief. Vietnam is the classic case study for anyone interested in how domestic politics shape decision making in general. Vietnam is a great case for the reasons I mentioned, in terms of you've got telephone recordings of Johnson and Nixon saying these things in crystal clear form. So I think Vietnam has my best evidence, because you literally have contemporary evidence of presidents saying this stuff. And some of the stories on their own that I uncover there won't be, particularly surprising to scholars who know the Vietnam War literature. So the idea that Johnson delayed the escalation of the war in 1965 because he feared the impact of the 1964 election. We have some evidence on that. And I alluded to Nixon and the decent interval strategy. I think what I've been able to do, and hopefully readers will agree, is piece together all of those stories in a way that creates a much more systematic sense of how these pressures manifested consistently over time. Very similar pressures repeatedly occur over time. So Vietnam, I mean, I could talk to endless until the cows come home on that. Korea, the evidence for Korea is less clear for those very practical reasons, but it does something different to most of the other cases, which is that it illustrates a dynamic which I think is less common than that which I described today. So I described how elections, lead to delays in costly decisions, and other cases look at how presidents dampen down decisions and make them less politically noisy. Korea is a very interesting case because it does the opposite. I think in 1950 you have the congressional midterms, and there is this, and you also have a very political general in Korea, Douglas MacArthur, who was essentially a Republican, and Truman feared that he would run against him in 52. But this huge desire for escalation among the public, and I think key political entrepreneurs like MacArthur and his allies in the media and in Congress are trying to promote that. And so in this case, I think you have a case where President Truman believes that the best thing for the United States is to keep the war limited, and he's very reticent to cross the 38th parallel. But I do think that a key factor in the reason why he did that on the eve of the 1950 midterms is the pressure from Republicans, is the pressure from Republican-aligned individuals to escalate that war. So that's a mechanism I call the spur mechanism, and it's kind of the opposite of the delay mechanism. So both of them have really interesting stories. I think electoral pressures work in slightly different ways across the cases. But yeah.
Well, while you're typing the question, I'll just ask another one if I might. Sort of just to go back to the surge example for a minute. I mean, what's the sort of period that you're looking at when you say, this is election worthy? So for example, and do you sort of see any differences in the time periods? Like, for example, if it was 2 years before and there's a sort of an understanding that there's going to be something that actually is going to last for a very long time and that you want to win a victory or something like this, with sufficient time so that it does have some sort of political impact. I mean, surely there's some sort of political advice, a Karl Rove character or somebody like that who will be giving their political advice about what would actually be good. Maybe they're doing some polling or some interviewing or something like this to try to gauge voters' preferences. So that's sort of like one thing, the long game, like how far back does one go? And the second part of that is, do you find that there's like immediately before an election, like a week before or a day before or 2 days before or something like that, that there's any evidence that, keep casualties down, keep things quiet or something like that? Do you see any evidence of that? And I'll come back to Jacob's question in just a moment afterwards.
Yeah, it's a really good question, again, as all of them. So it gives me an opportunity to talk about the when question a little bit more as well. So I think one thing which distinguishes my work from other work on elections and political pressures in general is that I think most work on this historically has looked at election years or the 3 months prior to an election. And a lot of this is quantitative, and necessarily you need to make some kind of scope conditions along those lines. And to a degree, it makes sense, right? In the just before an election, that is when political sensitivity may well be highest. But what I try and argue is exactly to your point. Presidents, administrations, political advisors don't just start thinking about the political implications of what they're doing in an election year. That maybe increases the importance of thinking about those considerations, but they do so across the whole electoral cycle. That doesn't mean that they are the same kind of considerations across the cycle. And I think actually one interesting thing to think about is how electoral pressures are qualitatively different at different phases of the electoral cycle, right? So immediately after you get elected, there is a political pressure that has something to do with elections, but it's about the previous election, right? It's about redeeming your campaign pledges. And then you have the midterm campaign, and you can probably split up the campaign season into, as you say, the immediate days and weeks before an election, the general election campaign, where your main opponent, of course, is from the other party, the primaries, where your opponent, you might have an internal challenge, or even your opponent might be fending off a challenge from someone within his own party, which changes the political dynamics as well. And then there's the anticipation of a campaign. So there might be an awareness that the campaign is going to be really hot next year. There are certain things that I probably don't want to do, so let's get it done and out of the way now, so that voters won't remember by the time we get to that stage. I suspect, and this is just a hunch, that the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, there may have been a little bit of that with that decision, in the terms of Biden clearly wanted to do that, so to a degree that decision was somewhat overdetermined by his strategic understanding of the situation. But the fact that he did it in year one of his presidency, perhaps hoping, probably reasonably, that voters would forget about it by the time the midterms or his re-election campaign went around, I think really speaks to this idea that electoral considerations can matter to different degrees and in different ways across different phases of the cycle. And you're absolutely right, casualty sensitivity as an election approaches certainly does increase. I know that even in the surge example, there were cables from Rumsfeld going to Casey, getting increasingly concerned about casualties and asking if there were ways to decrease that through the summer. There wasn't any smoking gun evidence I found of that being justified by electoral considerations, but I think it's not hard to piece the puzzle together.
Yes, I mean, I was sort of wondering in that sense whether it actually affects the adversaries' calculations that they're trying to mess up or sort of conduct operations to affect the U.S. electoral cycle or U.S. elections or something like this. So let me just get to Jacob's question, and then I think that'll be it. And then unless there are any further questions, I would recommend typing them in now. So Jacob asks, first, do you feel political parties and ideologies are affected by this differently? And second, it seems military decision-making could attempt to counteract this. Say troop surges and increased fatalities are most detrimental to election prospects. Could advisors and leadership begin asking for more troops pre-invasion, particularly to prepare for a counterinsurgency which requires more troops? And thanks for the question.
I'm off mute already. So political parties and ideologies is a really interesting one, which actually, so the book manuscript is due in September 1st. And it's one question I'm trying to grapple with over the summer when I'm doing some revisions to this, because I hadn't factored it in the original manuscript, but I think at least plausibly it is true that there would be variance in this, right? Particularly during the Cold War, but even since then, I think there's a sense that Republicans are more trusted on foreign policy. Republicans can probably get away with taking more risk, whereas Democrats, I think the concern is certainly with Truman in Korea, was lambasted for being soft on Russia, soft on the Soviet Union, And I don't think that any Democrat, certainly through the first 20 years of the Cold War, could probably have got elected unless they took a pretty tough line. So there actually are some studies, again, I can't remember this specific authors, but that looks at how casualty sensitivity can vary depending on who occupies the White House, which party occupies the White House. So there certainly is a distinction there. Exactly what that looks like, I need to map out and think through a little bit further. What was the question on? Can you maybe repeat that? I've forgotten.
Yeah, so it had to do with is there anything that commanders can do, sort of being aware that elections might be an issue, to do things more in advance, like ask for more troops. Sort of, to what extent are the commanders themselves aware that the election could pose a problem to their strategy, for instance, and do they actually include that when they're actually making strategy?
Yeah, so I think. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. No, so sorry. Hopefully that sort of captures the question. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm going to give you a very specific response of what I saw in these cases, and specifically the Iraq case from my conversations with those involved. I was surprised at the degree to which they were, I don't know if naive is the word, but weren't aware or only realized after the fact how much political considerations were shaping the administration's decision-making process on it. So General Casey was completely wrong-footed. I mean, I read the quote there, and partly this was, I think Bush had perhaps reasons which we could go on to, not to keep him completely in the loop. But the fact that he was completely wrong-footed by this and wondering, why am I getting these questions on why we should be reducing casualties, and why it came so out of the blue after the midterm elections. And also Mike Mullen was the same, and so was Cartwright. I think Mullen and Cartwright, the chairman and vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, agreed on very, very little. But one of the things was the degree to which I think the political context shaped Obama's decision-making in 2011 on the withdrawal from Iraq. But again, I don't think that was necessarily salient at the time. I think this speaks, I've got another paper in the works on the civil-military dynamics at stake in these cases, and I think it speaks to that. I don't think that senior military officers have a deep appreciation for the politics of national security, and in part that's intentional, right? Because I think professional military education has traditionally taught the Huntingtonian school of civil military relations, in which there's a separation. The military shouldn't be doing politics. So anything that sounds remotely partisan, they'll close their ears and won't be particularly interested to it. I think there's an interesting sort of literature burgeoning now on how that maybe is not helpful or constructive, but I think that might be one explanation of why actually I didn't see much evidence of the kind of bureaucratic active measures and sort of sneaky moves that commanders might take to counteract some of these pressures. So whether we want senior military officers to learn that or not, I don't know. Maybe we could debate that, but that's my impression anyway. It was a great question.
Yes, generals, as a matter of course, tend to be very political in terms of the whole notion of a political general, except in the sense that within a bureaucratic sense, they all want the top job and that kind of thing, but actual knowledge of what goes on in the White House and so forth, probably a lot less so. Well, look, as it's now 6 p.m. here, I'm afraid I will need to bring this session to a close. Andrew, thank you so much for a superb presentation, which I found extremely informative, and I'm certain you've definitely given us all a lot to take away from your talk. As I mentioned earlier, tonight's theme on this sort of the impact of elections and on wartime strategy, is one that I find fascinating, and you've certainly provided a superb overview of how this works in practice. So thank you very much indeed, Andy. And before leaving, I would like to just briefly remind you that the next session in the series will take place on the 9th of May, when Professor Bruce Gentleson of Duke University will be speaking about U.S. sanctions policy with respect to Russia. That'll be an in-person event, and the details are already posted on the eBay website, although I think it's going to be a hybrid event as well. The next online session in this series will be on the 17th of May, when Professor Vincent Intondi will be speaking on the topic of race and U.S. nuclear weapons policy. So I look forward to seeing you then, and thank you so much for attending this evening, and Andrew, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks everyone for dialing in.